So let's talk about virtual textures and runtime virtual textures. Virtual textures is a newer concept that's came around within the past few years, and it was implemented, I believe, first off in Unreal Engine 4.22 or 23, like one of the more recent iterations. So this is like a newer concept that they are working with. Virtual textures run in two different methods: runtime and streaming. How the streaming one works is it's a way to approach streaming instead of how it's normally done. So, how it's normally done is say you have a bunch of these textures in your game. Normally, on runtime, what happens is they're sent into this thing known as a texture streaming pool. And then how they're set up is when you see a texture in the game, it's just going to output either, depending on distance, a 64 by 64 resolution or 512 or 1024. And it's just the whole texture, but it's going to be done at different resolutions. And that's known as MIPS. It's similar to the concept of levels of detail in meshes. How streaming virtual textures works is it takes your texture, and then depending on how close you are to like a certain quadrant, it will break up your texture and divide it into different resolutions depending on how close you are. So when you're further off, it could be a full 512 texture, and then like this closer corner would be 1024, and then when you slowly start getting closer, it gets down to 2048 on these like closer corners, and then it starts to blend back. So instead of it taking the entire texture and setting it to like one of these low resolutions, it's only taking the area of the texture itself. This allows you to have more defined details on, like, say, larger meshes. Um, there is a bit of a cost with textures. So when you handle virtual textures, technically speaking, it samples it twice. So normally you'll have like one texture sample for one texture inside of your material editor. Every one of these normally is two. And one way to help out with that is having textures with the same UV set. So if you have a texture, or let's say you have multiple textures, like you have your albedo, you have your normal, and then you have your ORM, so long as they have the same UVs or there's using the same texture coordinate node, so say you like drive them all into it, Unreal Engine naturally stacks them together so that they create a bit of a performance buff having all those together. But if, say, you only have maybe a couple of these guys, like say maybe only these guys have a texture stack and then this has its own, you really will only get the benefits of just these two right here and not this one. So there are benefits. It's not a end all be all for everything, but it helps. Um, Another way that it helps out is normally textures work with the GPU with this texture pool. How the runtime textures work is it works with the CPU as well to help determine this calculation. And it helps with better processing of materials in a more faster approach. So here we have a scene. If I go into my settings, project settings, and then type in virtual, if I can spell it, virtual, you can go right here where it says in engine rendering under virtual textures, you can enable it. It may take a little bit of time because it's going to make you restart the level and recalculate all the things. So be very aware. Take some time and let it run so that it can process it, because it's adding in new architecture to your texture support. And then what you can do is I'm going to copy a couple of these base textures that I've made, and I'm going to bring this into this folder called VT. So if I go into one of these guys and these are gonna be their new copies in a sense. So I'm gonna go in here. You can actually go down and believe it is right here. You can adjust the texture to be virtual stream texture instead of normal method of streaming. You can do virtual, and then it does virtual streaming. And then you can hit save, and then you'll notice that your texture is a virtual texture right here at the bottom corner. Now, a new thing to note is inside the virtual texture, if we go into one of these materials, like I'll do a VT test master. If I bring in another one of these textures, like I'll bring in this ORM texture, which let me make sure sRGB is turned off, and it is. So let's hop in. I'll bring this guy in, and of course, with the sampler, it says linear color. If I bring in one of these guys, of course, it's not going to say, linear color would say color, but since it's a virtual texture, it now has a new type of sampler to worry about, known as virtual color. So actually, if I go in here, and let me delete that, and I go here, you can even go up to this texture action in the right click menu. You can even convert the texture here, and then you can adjust things like your texture size threshold. This is a way you can actually recursively update textures like in bulk. And then what it'll also do is once it samples everything, it will figure out all the materials that it uses and help update it on the fly as well. But here, since we're doing it, simply, you can just go here, turn on the virtual streaming, and then hit save. And then now let's hop into this guy, and you'll see that it's now updated to virtual color, virtual linear color. And then if I start to plug in these guys, let me plug in the roughness, roughness is here, our ambient occlusion, and then our metallic. And then let me bring in our menu for our, let's see, where is it at? Platform stat, no, not platform stats. Trying to find our stats. Here we go. So if you actually look down here, you'll see virtual texture stack and then virtual texture lookup. So our virtual texture stack tells us that these guys, since they are using the same UV set, they're going to be stacked together, creating a better optimized performance than, say, if I go here and then I add our own, like another one, you'll notice that if I do, let's say coordinate 2, so it changes the textures a bit, you'll see that now we have 2 texture stacks instead of just 1. So it's going to change the way these samplers are performed. And then actually, if you want to test out and see how, actually, I just realized I flipped this guy. Let me change that back. Metallic. And let's hit save. And then if you actually want to test out and view virtual textures in action, so I'm going to bring this into this guy. Let me hit save. And then what you can do is the button that's underneath escape, it's like a squiggly dash mark. If you'll notice right here at the bottom, when you press it, it will bring up this little command line. And what these are is it's the command line to enable CVARs, which are variables within the console that you can enable certain visual effects or debug features. So you can bring in this and do CVAR for R, which usually all these runtime commands run with an R dot, and then VT for virtual texture dot borders. And then what happens next is normally you hit spacebar and then either a 0 or a 1 to enable it. So I'm going to do 1 to enable and then hit enter. And then let me hit save on this. Let me make sure that, let me do our movable lights and let me hit play. Okay. Let me actually do one small thing. It might not like this texture. Let me bring in a couple other textures. Let me do these granite ones. Actually, no, let me bring in these painted metal ones. So I'm gonna copy these, bring them into our virtual texture, and then let me convert these guys to texture, and I'm gonna set them to a 1024 texture, convert them over, and then let me bring them into this instance. Do 512 for this guy. Actually, let me turn on virtual streaming for him. So you can actually see right here in this preview that it actually is starting to show up on here. But you can actually do it also in the material as well. Bring him in. Bring in our normal map right there. Actually, no, that's in the tangent. Here we go. Let's hit play. And you can actually see that it recursively is has a very large texture on here. But if I want to, I can actually hop in and bring in these textures, which are a lot larger. They're 1024 instead of these like 512. Let me convert these guys all to parameters. Okay, hit save. Now let's go into our instance and let's change out these textures. Normal and ORM. So you can actually see that it's actually creating these larger and smaller grids, and that is from this debug menu. So hit play. You can see how further off it's made a larger kind of black square. When we start getting closer, you're starting to see yellow kind of pop up now. And then we slowly start to get closer, it's creating smaller and smaller grids. And that's what it's doing is it's creating those more resolution heavy detail like 1024 or 2048 textures. And then when you get further away is when it starts to stream in the 512 and then 256 textures. So it's a better way of blending all these things together and without popping an entire texture, it's only blending small quadrants. And that essentially is the streaming portion of virtual textures. In the next part, I'm going to go over runtime virtual textures in a way to work with them with your landscape materials.